So how did you become a historian? That is to start in the center.
Indirectly, very indirectly. I had no love of history as a high school student. I had no need or desire to ever become a historian. And it's true for my years, let's say, in upper classes in high school in Paris, where I remember very well the history lessons on French history, of course, and didn't like it. I wasn't good either. And then in Israel, Jewish history, when I finished high school, didn't speak to me in the least. And then years went by, army and so on. And when I came back to Paris to study in the early 50s, I studied political science. I was at the Institut d'études politiques in Paris and worked at the Israeli embassy for my upkeep. And so I never thought of becoming a historian. Then I worked for years with Nahum Goldman, Shimon Peres, and so on. And when I came back to my doctoral studies in the very early 60s, 61 actually, in Geneva, my PhD was in political science, but I had chosen a historical topic, that is history, let's say, of international relations. And strangely enough, without being aware of it, I chose something, a topic which had to do with Nazi Germany, not with the Jews though, the American factor in German foreign and military policy between 1939, the beginning of the war, and 1941, when the United States entered the war. The question I was asking was, how did the idea, the perspective or not, of the US entering the war influenced Hitler's strategic thinking and the military decisions from up to down in Germany. I think the word Jew didn't even appear in. Maybe I am pushing it too far because, of course, Jewish Roosevelt and so on, in Hitler's eyes, played a role. But again, I still was intent on being a political scientist and actually eventually going into practical work in diplomacy or something like that. So I really am not born a historian, nor did I aspire to become a historian. But the past was pushing me without my really being aware that I was being pushed by the past. And when I was sitting in Bonn in the archives of the foreign ministry for this work on Hitler and the United States, I discovered a document which had been misplaced. In the file US Inlandswoge Vereinigte Staaten, I found a document, again misplaced, which told of a German diplomatic document telling of an invitation by Pope Pius XII to the intendant of the Berlin Opera, who was coming to Rome for whatever concert, to maybe he invited the orchestra, or part of it, of course, to come to his papal apartments to perform scenes out of Parsifal. It was December 41. And so I found this absolutely strange, not to say shocking, that the Pope could invite the Berlin Opera to perform Parsifal in his apartments in December 1941, when all the horror of the Eastern Front was already known, in part at least, in Rome as well. And that led me to come back to Bonn after finishing my PhD on the topic I mentioned, and to ask for the Vatican documents. And
what at that time? So
we are now in 1963.
No, but at the time in 1941, what was it exactly that the Vatican at that moment knew about?
They knew about the shooting, the mass execution of Jews on occupied Soviet territory. That is the notorious Einsatzgruppen operations, killing thousands and thousands, actually within the 6 months between the attack, German attack on the Soviet Union in June 41 and the end of the year. There were some 700,000 Jews killed, murdered by the Einsatzgruppen. And this was in part known at the Vatican because of various people they had in Eastern Poland, which was partner of those of this murderous campaign. It had been occupied by the Soviets between 1939 and 1941, so it was liberated Soviet territory by the Germans, right? And in Poland, of course, there were a lot of emissaries of the Vatican informing of what was going on, Eastern Polish territory and the General Government also, and then many messages came from the Ukraine and so on. So that we know that there was good knowledge, if maybe not complete knowledge, but good knowledge at the Vatican about what was going on in the Eastern territories under German occupation. But all in all, the persecutions were known. The hunt for the Jews was known. So
at that time also things happened with priests in Poland.
And priests in Poland, and the mentally ill in Germany, right? The killing of the mentally ill. So things were pretty clear about the murderous dimension of the regime, particularly after the beginning of the war. So the invitation to the Berlin Opera, which I'm sure was also had its artistic reasons. I'm not saying this was purely a political act, but I'm sure that the Pope was aware of the political dimension of an initiative of that kind, which, by the way, it never took place, the concert. It was cancelled then. I don't know, or nobody knows by whom, but it didn't take place. So, but still, you ask me, how did I become a historian? This, in a way, led me to come back to Bonn, to ask for the Vatican files. And as I was preparing then the documentation, which became a book, Pius XII and the Third Reich, in 1964, I felt that here I was suddenly doing something which fitted my, how could I say, this was fitting to me much more than political science, much more than my previous inquiries. I was suddenly dans mon élément, you would say in French. And I realized, of course, it didn't demand much introspection to understand that actually my past was coming back, that I had spent the war from 1942 to the end and a little beyond the end in a Catholic seminary. I had been baptized and was firm Catholic during the war years as a kid, of 10 to 13, 14. And so this topic of the church and the Third Reich was exactly, and the Jews, was exactly what was the core of my being at that time. And from then on, it became for me, I mean, I started writing on those topics from various angles, but by now I had found my way. Uh, so that's why I said indirectly. I really had no passion for history as a youngster, nor any interest, major interest, over the early years of adulthood. And then, for some reason, I chose a kind of historical approach to the Third Reich, which was already closed, for my dissertation, but still not aware that I was really coming back slowly to my own existential, in a way, framework. And then with the Pope, with this incident and with the book on the Vatican, I suddenly was back dans mon élément.
How would you summarize what were your conclusions in that book, really?
About the Pope?
Yep.
At that time, the book came out in '64, which, by the way, was in the midst of the Rolf Hochhuth controversy. Rolf Hochhuth was a German playwright, indeed, and had written a play which became a worldwide sensation, Le Vicaire, der Stellvertreter in German, about Pope Pius XII and his inaction, let's put it that way, during the extermination of the Jews of Europe, and specifically the deportation of the Jews of Rome in '43. So I didn't know of the play when I was assembling my material, and I never met Hochhuth personally, but we spoke on the phone a year or two later. But my book came out in this controversy. By then I was aware of the controversy, and so it created a lot of positive and negative reactions, also positive, and also from Catholic priests or even Cardinal Tisserand, who wrote to me a letter published in the meantime saying it's good that the truth be known and so on. The conclusions were that as a political institution, the calculations of the Vatican could be seen from a political angle as ultimately unacceptable, but acceptable in the context of the fear of Bolshevism and the need to do everything to support the forces that would fight the oncoming Bolshevik threat, mainly after Stalingrad. From a spiritual viewpoint, there was a lapse, or at least it looked like a lapse for a personality, the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, who by his definition of his own role, and I don't speak of Pius XII now, but of the papacy, of the Pope, was a representative of the highest moral force in the world, right? That was his self-definition. And on that count, the silence in the face of such abomination, which certainly was well known in '43 when the Jews of Rome were deported, was a lapse which would remain as a kind of deep shadow on the history of the Church. And on that, the debate was on that. And I didn't, for years and years, didn't really, I followed the documentation and the controversies, And now, very recently, in 2010, the French, my French publisher, the same as in the old days, republished this book, and I added a kind of short conclusion, bringing the topic maybe to its present, to what we know today, and didn't change my opinion, which you may say, well, it's to be expected, but I'm very detached from the topic today, and yet the new material we have accumulated over 45 years seems to indicate the same conclusions.
What method did you use in that book? What methodology did it have? You said something about that in the introduction to the book, I remember.
You mean the first edition?
Yeah, the book.
I must say that I never reread my introduction, not even for this, but I know what concerned me at the time. What concerned me was more to find a safeguard against myself. That is, that one could say, and it has been said, but I never really went into debates and so on to express about myself, about the topic, yes. The safeguard about myself, one could say, well, this guy has been saved by in a Catholic institution. It's true. Certainly by being from 42 to the end of the war in this Catholic institution under another name and so on, another identity, baptized and everything, I was saved. So I must have probably, one could say, some kind of resentment which led me to write a book so critical of the Pope, who was the Pope at the time when I was saved. So I was aware of what could be said, and I had given that manuscript first, the manuscript of this book, to Les Éditions de Minuit, which is a French publisher, at the time, very left-wing and Jewish, Jérôme Lindon, who had just published La Torture, I think, or about torture in Algeria. It had another title, it escapes me at this moment. But
La Question.
La Question, that's it. Thank you. So I gave him the manuscript, and he read it within a day and told me, this will be a book, and so on. And to my personal misfortune, I regret, in a way regret on a subjective level, not on an objective level, I had to take the manuscript back because I understood that this was a wrong choice. Left-wing publisher, Jewish publisher. Of course, that would reinforce the argument that there was here a kind of emotional resentment, a desire of being aggressive, which was not my intention in any way. So I took the manuscript and went to a left-wing, liberal, open, Catholic publisher, Les Éditions du Seuil, at that time still very much directed by its owner and the person who established, Paul Flamand, remarkable man, remarkable publisher. And he took the manuscript and said, we will read it together, and I will ask another historian, Jacques Nobécourt, a good friend of mine, Catholic, very Catholic, to participate, and we will see where your voice is, let's say, not neutral. And indeed, that is what they didn't impose on me any change, but they asked me at some moments when I said, let's say, this and this and this was the attitude of so on and so on, to say maybe, I mean, to put elements of, let's say, hesitation in strict affirmations in order to leave it open, which I did. Flamand, by the way, went to Rome, went to the Vatican, spoke to the then Secretary of State, I think it was Paul VI, who was the Pope. Monsignor Casaroli was the Secretary of State, asked him if I could have access to the Vatican documents, was told that I could not have access to the Vatican documents of the wartime. To this day, nobody has had access except 4 Jesuit historians who, of course, selected documents. So that the book was published with the German documents only, but this is said clearly in the introduction, if I remember correctly what I remember of the introduction, and it said clearly how much care was taken of keeping a distance and not getting in any way passionate or involved emotionally in the conclusions of the book. So that is probably the method you mentioned, but I'm not sure. I did use documents in there, and I used entire texts. Actually, the subtitle of the book is Une documentation, a documentation. Pie XII et le Troisième Reich, une documentation. That is, I didn't ever pretend that I was writing a historical book of the usual kind, but that I argued that I had brought together a collection of documents for reasons which were explained. I didn't have the Vatican documents, but I had the German documents accessible at that time, and not much has been added to that for the war period regarding the way German diplomats and others saw the Vatican and the relations and the correspondence of German diplomats. I used the American Foreign Relations of the United States, which is the collection of American documents. I used some British documents, some French documents, which one had access to, and documents from the Zionist archives in Jerusalem, which were important mainly for attempts at the end of the war to have access to Jewish children hidden in Catholic institutions. That is what I had at the time, and whatever documents published by the church one could have at the time, I of course included. But I didn't select the documents, or I didn't mainly cut the texts, because, again, for the reason which I mentioned before, that is not to give any opening to the argument that I was manipulating my documentation. So I was really, it was a collection de documents, and the short comments made from one document to the other to put them in context, right? The responses to the attack, the German attack on the Low Countries and Belgium and so on. I had to explain what was going on in a few words, then the document or the documents. So this was all, it had the same aim, to give as distant and objective a picture as I could. And I can say to this day that I don't know of any major document that I could have known at that time, German, American, English, or Zionist, let's say, that I missed. Of course, today we know more, but that came over the last 10 years. There has been a book a few years ago called, in English, Hitler's Pope. And I surely don't want to paint or to present Pacelli as Hitler's Pope. No way. There was certainly a lot of tension between Nazi Germany and the Vatican on church issues and on the persecution of the Polish church and of troubles made for the German church. I mean, and all in all, Nazi policies were surely not welcome as such regarding church matters. And in that context, whether Pius XII was culturally very close to German culture, I would say yes, but why not? He could have been close to French culture. He was an Italian, but he had been nuncio, that is delegate of the Vatican in Germany, first in Bavaria and then in Berlin, from 1916, I think, or 17, until 1929. So he knew German perfectly. He was very close to German culture and had those surrounding him were mostly Germans. His head of household, Sister Pascalina, was a Bavarian, and his confessor was a German, and so on. So that I say, and there is nothing wrong about that. His anti-Semitism was really his slightly negative attitude towards Jews was part of the attitude of the church of his time. Even the very strong pope which preceded him, Pius XI, was in that sense also an the Vatican and the Jews, there's a book with that title, shows that the church at its core was critical or hostile even to Judaism, to the Jews, and to the activity of the Jews in the world, the Jews penetrating Christian civilization to destroy it, and so on. So the attitude of the Vatican was traditionally no to racial anti-Semitism because of dogmatic problems. If race is the major factor, then baptism has no value, you understand?
Yeah.
That is, no converted Jew is seen as anything else but a Jew by the racial theories. No to racial anti-Semitism, but yes to defensive anti-Semitism, which is defending the Christian society against the infiltration of world Jewry. And when in 1928, Pope Pius XI, condemned a Catholic organization which tried to find a rapprochement with Jews by changing some of the liturgy, which was very anti-Jewish, on Vendredi Saint, Holy Friday in English. You prayed for perfidious Jews, les Juifs perfides, and then you were not allowed to genuflect. You prayed for many groups and genuflected each time, but for the Jews, no genuflection and perfidious, which was centuries and centuries of Catholic ritual and prayer. And when a group in 1928 tried to change that, it was dismissed by the Holy Office. And the Jesuit periodical Civiltà Cattolica, the most important Jesuit periodical actually in the world, explained the position by titling the explanation the Jewish peril. So, no racial anti-Semitism, but defensive anti-Semitism. This was Pius XI's. Although he became more and more anti-Nazi towards the end of his life, it was taken over, of course, by Pius XII, and was the common, not totally accepted, but majority accepted attitude of the Church in its official statements regarding the Jewish question. So, if you ask me, Pius XII an anti-Semite, not in the extreme sense, but yes, in the defensive sense. The Jews are dangerous and should be converted, of course.
So that makes it more understandable that he has not intervened.
Yeah, of course, it makes it more understandable. But it's more complicated than that. I think that the question is ultimately, was the Jewish issue, that is the extermination of the Jews, by 1943, this was clear, and he knew it perfectly well from hundreds of sources. Was it a crucial challenge to Christian consciousness, or was it a marginal matter? If it was crucial to Christian consciousness, then his silence was very problematic morally. But it's very probable that he didn't, that in the calculations of the Pope as a politician, as a diplomat, it could well be that this was a marginal matter. We will never know that. But of course, his main aim, or his main fear, was the Bolshevism, and the Germans were then, as the Secretary of State defined it, a bulwark against the approaching communists, and there were communist elements in the Italian resistance, which the Pope was very much worried about. And he said to the Americans, there can be disorder and so on, and praised the Germans in a way for keeping things in hand. That's, of course, one aspect. And then the great, I think, ambition was to create a new coalition of the Western Christian forces, Great Britain, the United States, and a non-Nazi Germany, as a defense of Christianity against a threat from the East. And that's what, by the way, that's what happened in the Cold War. Not that the Pope turned it into that, but remember Schumann, de Gasperi, and who was the third one? Schumann, the French, de Gasperi, and Adenauer, of course. This was the coalition of the 50s against the Soviet Union, of course, organized by the United States. So in that sense, if we take those big aims as the core of Vatican diplomacy, the Jewish question from this viewpoint looked a minor matter. The answer to this is, yes, this may be a background, but this is not the whole story. The Pope thought that making a declaration would endanger the Church and endanger the Church in Germany, let's say, or occupied countries, and endanger the Jews hiding. And so he preferred to help wherever he could help. But from what I know, the research which we know of to this point, in time that is 2010, shows that the Church helped in many places in Europe and I am myself proof of it. But these were initiatives which came from the local bishops or from the local institutions, even in Italy. And there is no sign of any instruction, even oral instruction, given by Pius XII to help or not to help. That is, it's silence. So it could again be a matter of being very careful and not to give any opening to the Germans, let's say, to retaliate. Or it could mean that this was a secondary matter.
In the little essay, you mentioned an encyclical of Pius XI that he was writing just before his death, Humani Generis Unitas, that was then put to sleep by Pope Pius XII. Did you know about that when you were writing the book, or is that new?
Yeah, that's new. Nobody knew about it as far except those who were involved in this. A book came out in 2005 or 4 by two authors. One of them a priest, I think, Paselek, and called L'Encyclique cachée du Saint-Siège, a missed opportunity of the church again to speak against anti-Semitism. It has a long title. I forgot now the exact title. And it was a revelation. What they tell in that book is that in the summer of 1938, Pius XI, already not in good health and frail, decided nonetheless to take an initiative against Nazi anti-Semitism and asked from an American Jesuit, a German Jesuit, and a French Jesuit, John Lafargue, the American, Gundlach, the German, and de Bucois, the French, to write the draft of an encyclical, that is a pronouncement of the Pope. These are the main pronouncements against racial anti-Semitism. And that would probably have been ready sometime at the end of 1938. Now, it was ready in the autumn of 1938. It was sent to Rome, given, I don't know now by whom, to the general of the Jesuits, Father Ledochovsky, for seeing if this was an acceptable text. He was also editor-in-chief of or at least responsible for the Civiltà Cattolica, which was really anti-Semitic at that time. He himself was a Polish priest, general of the Jesuits. He kept it. I mean, the Civiltà, the Cattolica and Ledochovsky kept that for quite a long time, until finally it was given to Pope Pius XI. He was dying, and it was found next to him, next to his bed, at his death. Of course, Pius XII, who succeeded within days, could not have ignored that. He was Secretary of State before, and surely was given a document of that importance. And he decided to shelve it for whatever reason, but the reason probably was that he wanted to try a policy of appeasement in regard to Germany, contrarily to the growing tension which his predecessor was leading to.
So can you tell me something about the methodology you used in the book on the Pope?
Yes, I will. Maybe I will read the introduction, which was the introduction of the first edition, right, 1964, and which I kept in the re-edition of 2010 because the method is the same. And I will read it out in French, which it was written in that language, and it says what it says. After mentioning the controversy about the question of the Pope's silence, I went on saying the following. Face à un tel problème, l'historien peut difficilement prétendre à une parfaite objectivité. And then I go on saying that notwithstanding this difficulty of remaining objective, there are rules to be followed very strictly. And here I say, malgré toutes les accusations, réfutations, etc., une possibilité d'investigation honnête demeure, s'en tenir autant que possible aux documents. Telle est la règle de l'étude que nous avons entreprise. So the first rule, keep to the documents. And then I go on and I say, not only keep to the documents, but in this case, at least because of the possible accusations of all kinds, quote the documents in extenso, without cutting them. And I say it in those terms exactly. Or, c'est là le second principe méthodologique que nous nous sommes imposés. Seule la citation du document in extenso permet au lecteur d'en évaluer la portée et les nuances véritables. That is, only in having the document totally in extenso would allow the reader to sense the importance of the document and its significance within the context.
Did it help you? Were you not accused for writing this book for spite and for being Jewish?
Well, that, of course, the argument was constantly that this must have been written, the argument on one side, because there was another side. That is, those were for the book. The argument was, well, it's written for some reason, because of resentment, and of course, he's Jewish, and therefore there is a subjective element here which implies, etc. So, I just repeated what I read here, and I also mentioned the way I had gone about publishing this book, that is in a Catholic, left-wing, but nonetheless Catholic publishing house, which was well known in France at the time, and with friends helping me to tone down sentences or questions which could have been considered as too sharp. So it's a very toned down version of what I could have written without this help. But I like it that way.
What was your final conclusion, if you summarize?
The final conclusion at the time was, in 64, was that Pius kept silent because of political opportunism, let's put it very bluntly, regarding the risks and so on facing Germany, that is the Vatican in face of Germany, and mainly the danger, the peril of Bolshevism moving towards the center of Christian Europe, a situation which at that time could be held back or dealt with only thanks to the German bulwark. I don't mean the Nazi bulwark, but that was the situation. The bulwark represented by the German army, whatever the regime, which, again, I said the Pope did not like. But I'm sure he considered Bolshevism as the greater danger to the church and to Christianity.
And what is the essence of the essay which you recently added to the book?
Well, in essence, I added a few arguments. I mean, the essay is based on many monographs written over the years, over 45 years, on the Vatican, where there are new things. And based also on new archives. Archives published, by the way, by the Vatican, that is the Vatican allowed historians to get into or to get at part of the material, the archival material, for the papacy of Pius XI. Now, for the topic, it's quite important because it says a lot about Pius XI, and also because Cardinal Pacelli, or before that, Bishop Pacelli, then Cardinal Pacelli, then Pope Pius XII, was the nuncio in Germany, in Munich, then in Berlin, and became Secretary of State of Pius XI in 1930. And up to Pius XI's death, 1939, and then a few weeks later, the same Cardinal Pacelli became Pope Pius XII. So it says a lot about his political attitudes. At the time, he was nuncio and then Secretary of State, and explains a lot about his position later on when he was Pope, mainly on the Jewish issue. Now, the conclusion added to what I said before regarding communism, Bolshevism, and let's say political opportunism would be, in a nutshell, that because of his prior stances, also on the Jews, Pius XII probably did not consider the Jewish issue and the extermination of the Jews as a major problem or a major issue, a major moral issue for the Catholic Church at the time. He had these world problems which he considered as central, deriving from the Bolshevik threat and so on, and plans for a reshuffling of alliances. I think in all that, plus his mild anti-Jewish positions over the years, which we see very well in the 30s, for all those reasons, I think that he had no compassion for the fate of the Jews of Europe.
Okay. Then, what did you do? What did you earn your living with while you were writing the book? How long did you take to write the book?
You mean the book about the Pope or my dissertation?
No, the book about the Pope.
About the Pope?
Yeah.
Well, I did my dissertation. I came from Israel after having worked, as I told you, first with Nachum Goldman, that was work in the States and in Israel. He was the president of the World Zionist Organization and of the World Jewish Congress. I was his political secretary. Then I worked when I got married in 1959 and started working in Israel with Shimon Peres, who was then Vice Minister of Defense. And after a year of working with Shimon Peres, I decided that this all was not where I wanted to go. decided to get back to my studies, tried my luck at the Hebrew University, couldn't get a fellowship because we hadn't enough money for, an upkeep of several years. I couldn't get a fellowship, couldn't be assistant or something. And so went to the place which offered me a fellowship. I had asked several places, and that was the Graduate School of International Studies in Geneva. The then director, Fremont, wrote to me that I was welcome to my doctoral studies and I would tutor younger students and be given a fellowship. So I came there and worked as a TA, you would call it teaching assistant, and so on, and did my usual exams for doctorate and started and wrote my thesis. When I finished my doctorate, by pure chance, don't forget, we speak of the mid-60s, not even the earlier part of the 60s, the university landscape was opening immensely. And as one of my colleagues fell ill, and as there was enough need, they offered me a job. And when I wrote the book about the Pope, I was already assistant professor, that is the first level, right, at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, so that I used my vacations and so on to travel to Germany and to do my research. Sometimes went for a very few days and came back and had material Xerox at the time, photographed, right? And so I worked. I had a job. So there was nothing, it was hard work, but nothing special about this.
So then what after the book? There was a lot of hubbub, a lot of noise.
Yeah.
And then what did you feel like doing? Because I remember when we met for the first time in 1966, you told me that the next book you wanted to write was about the psychological basis of National Socialism, and that you wanted to write it together with a psychologist.
That came later. The book that came after the book on the Pope, it took me some time to get back on my feet, if I may say, from the book on the Pope, because it had created so much turmoil. But again, we speak now of 64, 65, 66. Then I wrote rapidly a book which was linked to the previous subject, a biography of Kurt Gerstein, who was an SS in the Waffen-SS, that is the military SS, the man in charge of the hygiene, of disinfection within the hygiene department of the Waffen-SS. And as such, and he had some medical training and engineering training, was in charge of, at some moment, was given the task of taking a quantity of a gas, a disinfection gas, Cyclone B, transporting it to eastern Poland, Lublin, and leaving it there. And as he was in Lublin, which was the headquarters of the extermination camps of eastern Poland, the Aktion Reinhardt camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. As Gerstein was there, he was offered a visit to the Belzec extermination camp with he says in his, what he wrote at the end of the war, with the head of the whole operation, Globocnik. I'm not sure that Globocnik went along, but Gerstein manifestly saw the camp and was there present at the extermination of a train of Dutch Jews. So that I was told where the documents of Gerstein were. Why Gerstein? Because the figure was astonishing. Well, why astonishing? Because he tried then to let the world know what he had seen. I will come back to it in a second. Why did I think of Gerstein? Because in Hochhuth's play, he is mentioned as a personage trying to alert the world, and in particular the Vatican. And in Hochhuth's play, it is said that he was thrown out of the Vatican legation in Berlin, which is true, from what I know. It's thrown out because an SS coming there can be totally ordinary reason for his being asked not to come in. So I knew that about this person, and I, of course, was intrigued and asked a colleague of mine, Leon Polyakov, who had written something about him, where the documents were, and I was given access to the Gerstein Fund of documents in Westphalia, and took the documents and constructed this biography of Gerstein. There was a huge documentation about him. So that's the book I did after the book on the Pope. It had really some relation with the prior subject, this time turning to Protestantism, but to a Protestant who was a kind of great figure in the evangelical church as a resistor and so on. Also, Gerstein tried to alert the world. He talked to a Swedish diplomat in the train, taking him back from Belzec, Warsaw, Berlin, and the Swedish diplomat von Otter promised to inform Stockholm, which he did. And we know after the war, von Otter spoke of his conversation with Gerstein, but the Swedes kept the information locked in their safe. They didn't want to somehow antagonize the Germans by informing the Allies and so on. Then he tried to get into the Vatican legation in Berlin and was expelled. Then he tried to speak to the Swiss, I think, to the consul. He tried a few things. He was a very strange person, by the way. A very torn personality. At the end of the war, he suffered more and more. He has an extraordinary letter written by him to his father in 1944. The father was a Nazi, and Kurt Gerstein wrote to him, how can a father follow this guy? I mean, a letter which was prudent, but which was extraordinary, an extraordinary moral document. At the end of the war, he met the Americans liberating Bavaria, surrendered, wrote 4 reports on what he had seen in Belzec, telling his story from A to Z. One in English, one in French, I think, one of course, in German. 3 reports, I think. And the Americans delivered him to the French. The French considered him as a war criminal because he was in charge of delivering the poison gas to the camps. He continued after Belzec to do that, and he argues that he tried to destroy it, that he wanted to see what was going on and inform the world. He was sent to prison in Paris and committed suicide. He was, by the way, condemned as a small criminal by the court in Germany. His family was not given a pension or anything, but then was rehabilitated 15 years after the war or more. In 66, I think he was rehabilitated. So that's the book I wrote after Pius XII. And then, after writing a book on Israel, I went Réflexions sur l'avenir d'Israël in 68, 69. I indeed came back to the subject of the psychology of the criminality in Nazism. And this became actually Histoire et Psychanalyse.
But you didn't write that together with a psychiatrist?
No, I wrote it alone. I never wrote a book with a psychiatrist. But this I wrote on my own, having had some experience of psychoanalysis personally, having read quite a lot on psychoanalysis as theory and also on psychohistory as an application of psychoanalysis to historical studies. I thought, well, if there is a domain where this should be used, it's, of course, the behavior of the perpetrators in the epoch of Nazism. Finally, I wrote something much more general on the use of psychoanalysis in history, mentioning its application. My conclusion was that it's problematic, actually, for various reasons. And then, maybe before, you may be right, I wrote a book called L'Antisémitisme nazi, Histoire d'une psychose collective. You see, it's linked with the... And there I tried to apply what I afterwards considered as unfeasible to Nazi anti-Semitism, a kind of psychohistory. But it's a kind of book I wouldn't want to republish today.
What did you expect of the possibility of psychohistory?
Well, I came to a negative conclusion. I thought that facing the complexities of historical experience and of history as an interaction of an infinity of elements which you had to conceptualize and so on. What happened if you try to apply the concepts of psychoanalysis? You flattened this. It was reductionist. You reduced the rich complexity to simplistic patterns or simplistic concepts, which may have been very important if repeated and looked at from several angles in an individual therapy, but in my opinion couldn't be applied significantly to social phenomena. That's why I came to this negative conclusion and never touched the topic really later on, except in hints here and there.
In the conclusions of that book, L'Histoire et Psychanalyse, you wrote that history cannot really be well written when it is not from within and from without at the same time. And I think that you have applied those methods in later writing.
That is true, but not in using any psychohistorical intentional framework. I kept to this later on, but I don't think that the way I wrote later surely I am aware of, normally, After all, I told you it's normal that I would be aware of sometimes the usefulness of being psychologically nuanced and understanding the writer and the writing and the choice of subjects and the attitude of individuals in history and so on, from let us say informed psychological viewpoints, psychoanalytic if you wish, but not as I didn't use it afterwards as a system of rigid application of concepts to social phenomena.